You may have noticed that I was not here for the first half of this morning's service. I like to sleep in on Yom Kippur. I have some bad news. There are only 2 jokes in this sermon, and you just heard the better one. More bad news. That was the other joke. Told you the first one was better. Now that is out of the way, actually, obviously, hopefully obviously, I was not sleeping in. I was with our teen community, along with Rabbi Wollner and Carly Abramson, just on the other side of this wall. And for those watching at home, you can see on your screen a picture taken about an hour ago. That is the other side of the sanctuary wall. For those here, if you crane your necks back, you can see it as well on the screen above your heads. We did this service for Rosh Hashanah too, and I will tell you, it's only 20 feet away, but there is a certain discombobulation that comes from transitioning from wearing a t-shirt, sitting in the grass, to wearing this robe, standing here in this sanctuary. 20 feet, but a world away. There is something beautiful about being on the other side of this wall, about watching our teens lead in song. By the way, they will be leading at Shabbat services tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, right here in this space. And also hearing them share their reflections on experiencing a time that will undoubtedly shape the rest of their lives. For those beyond teenage years, do you remember how transformative that period was for you? Just imagine all of that, the usual teenage angst. Nothing usual about that. But just all of that overlaid upon a world that looks like this. How deeply, profoundly moving to be able to learn from people experiencing so much, so early in their lives. But in the middle of all of this praying, singing, reflecting during our service last week on the other side of this wall, the FedEx truck drives on by, and I am reminded, it might be the new year for us, but for everybody else, it's Tuesday. Our longtime members know this, but it bears repeating. Our sanctuary was built in the shape of a half circle. A half circle, by the way, if you think about it, it's not a shape. It is half a shape. The idea of this half shape is to remind us that what completes us and fulfills us, what makes us whole, fulfills the mission of Judaism, all of that is on the other side of this wall. So let's talk about what's on the other side of that wall right now. It's not good. Take a moment, for those of you that are here in person, look around this immense sanctuary. There are something like 1,400 seats in this space. In our country, this is not even how many people died from COVID-19 on Tuesday, and again yesterday. And this is how many people will die tomorrow, and for who knows how many days to come. And this is also how many people, not that have died or will die, but are dying today as we sit in this space. Each of these people with a story, each with a tragedy. According to one study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association between March 2020 and January 2021, a 10-month period, there were 378,039 deaths from COVID in the United States. If you compare it to the same time period from a year before, you would expect that there would be 378,039 more deaths in this current period versus the last one prior to COVID. You would expect that, but that is not what you would see. What you would see is that there were 522,368 more deaths. If 378,039 of them were from COVID, what about the rest? 144,329. The study's authors suggest some might be undiagnosed COVID cases, but also, in their words, non-COVID-19 deaths secondary to the pandemic, such as from delayed care or behavioral health crises. That comes out to 481 people every day dying, not from COVID, but because of it. And that was only until January 1st of 2021. That was before we read stories about people dying from preventable conditions after being turned away from dozens of hospitals due to lack of beds. Before we read about children having their appendixes burst in ER waiting rooms. Before we had to consider what the cost might be of staffing shortages in nursing homes. Before people began ingesting horse dewormer. Before. But all of these horrors, all of what I have described, and so much more, that is on the other side of this wall. I don't need to tell you that Yom Kippur is a difficult day, a dreadful day. But right now, what is waiting for us on the other side of this wall is worse. In a world so dreadful, being here, even on this day of dread, being here feels like sanctuary. Today, this wall is not just separating us from the world on the other side, it's protecting us. Today is a day we sit in here reading admonitions that we steal, we slander, we are immoral. And for many of us, this exercise, saying these words, is a welcome reprieve from reading whatever is on the front page of today's newspaper. Think about that. How bad must things be for someone to say, I wish it was Yom Kippur? And yet today is perhaps the only day of the year I have no idea what those headlines are, and the only day of the year I have no interest in finding out. And for that, I stand here, personally grateful. Today is Yom Kippur. Recently in the New York Times, Tish Harrison Warren, an Anglican priest, wrote a column titled, What Should You Do with Your COVID Fatigue? Her suggestion is, in her words, we grieve, we admit we are worn out, we do what we can to help, which for most of us is simply to continue to wear masks and get vaccinated, and we take up the practices of patience and perseverance amid uncertainty. She continues, perseverance isn't simply a grin and bear it stoicism, much less a call to deny our frustration, disappointment, or anxiety about what lies ahead. Quoting her own religious tradition, she defines perseverance as needing to finish its work on us, that we might become mature and complete. What to do with everything on the other side of this wall? Let it sober us, let it vex us, but ultimately, let it grow us into stronger people than we were before. This is good advice, especially for those of us who are always searching for the silver lining or unable to shake free the idea that our story, by definition, must have a happy ending. This is not a movie. There is no script. This is good advice to persevere, but it's not particularly Jewish, and that's okay. It does come from an Anglican priest. As we sit, protected from all that is on the other side of this wall, grateful for the ability to do so, we remind ourselves we cannot stay here. That is the intended message of this half of a shape. Ephraim Weitzman, who designed this space, wanted it to be a reminder that it is incomplete without everything that extends beyond this wall behind me. The sun is high above us, but it is already time to think about what happens once it sets. Our final service is called Ne'ilah. Literally, the word means closing or locking. According to tradition, the name comes from the final service in Jerusalem just before the literal gates of the temple closed. As time passed, our tradition reinterpreted the gates into the gates of heaven that open now are slowly beginning to close. The scholar Ruvain Hammer notes the urgency of the liturgy that we read on this day. Open the gates for us at this time when the gates are closing, for the day wanes. The day will wane, the sun will set and disappear, yet let us come into your gates, O God. Urgent, yet as he observes, we have had an entire day to achieve atonement. Indeed, we have had 10 whole days of penitence preceded by a month of preparation. For those of us finding ourselves banging on the metaphoric gates year after year as the sun is low in the sky, take some comfort that our spiritual ancestors apparently did the same. And perhaps let this message, while the sun is still high in the sky, be a gentle suggestion to use your remaining time wisely. My teacher, Rabbi Richard Levy, Zichrono Livracha, taught my other teacher, Rabbi Bess Wollner, who taught me an interesting observation about the word for this final service, ne'ilah. It shares the same root as the word na'al. Na'al is a sandal or a shoe. What could possibly be the connection between the closing service of Yom Kippur and footwear? As Rabbi Levy taught, we spend our day in the sanctuary focused on ourselves and sheltered from the troubles of whatever is out there. But then ne'ilah comes. The gates lock closed. The prayer books go back on the shelves where they wait for another year. And that leaves us with a choice. What do we do with the words and prayers of these books that were evoked within us? Without a book, without a sanctuary, do we too put these ideas on the shelf for another year? And I'm afraid to say for too many of us too often the answer is yes. What Rabbi Levy taught was Yom Kippur isn't the end. Even when the gates are closed, it is not over. It is never over. It is a beginning. This day, divorced from the world, should be what motivates us to commit to re-engaging in it. As our prayer book reminds us, words lead us to the edge of action, but it is deeds, not words, deeds that bring us closer to the God of light. Tonight, as the gates close with ne'ilah, we put down our books, we put na'alayim on our feet, and we get to work. You may be familiar with the tradition of some Jews to come home from Yom Kippur services and immediately begin to start hammering away at their sukkah. As a rabbinical student in Los Angeles, I lived in a neighborhood where such a sight was common. I always figured that it was an act of commitment, a way of saying, despite my exhaustion, despite however I feel after a whole day sitting in the sanctuary, I am not going to take it easy tonight. I will not tarry for a moment preparing for the next holiday. But it turns out that's only half of it. The tradition is actually much broader than building a sukkah at the end of Yom Kippur. The tradition is to come home from Yom Kippur and perform a mitzvah. Not a particular mitzvah, any mitzvah. It just happens that with Sukkot 4 days away, that was the one that became customary. Fair enough. Many Jewish communities observe a second day of Rosh Hashanah. I would say at this time, in this world, in this place, it is time for us to observe a second day of Yom Kippur. That sounds like a joke, but I promise you it is not meant to be. Second day Yom Kippur is a day not marked on any calendar, but ought to be equally holy and consequential as anything that takes place here today. It is a time where we apply whatever thoughts go through our heads in these sacred hours and translate them into actions tonight and tomorrow. We spend so much of this holy time talking about what we want to do differently in the next year, making commitments, resolutions based on the changes we hope to make in ourselves. But a year is a long time. What are you going to do next year? No. What are you going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do tonight? Are you going to go home and rant and rave that half the people in our state are not fully vaccinated? Or are you going to find a way to talk to your neighbor, your coworker, your aunt in a way that leads them to get the vaccine? And before you scoff at my naivete, there are people among us sitting here who have done that. People in this room who have put aside their frustration and anger and listened to the concerns of others and were responsible for vaccines going into arms. There are people in this room who have done that. And that is but one example. This is a dreadful time. We must accept that. We must persevere. The Jewish way to do that is to be able to say, this is a dreadful time, and this is what I am doing to try to make it better. So I ask, what are you going to do? Not in 5782. What are you going to do tonight? What mitzvah will you complete? Who will you call? Where will you sign up to volunteer? What organization will you support? What are you going to do tonight? The Yom Kippur gates are closing. I pray that all of us are able to find nourishment and at 1 minute before they do. And I pray that once they do, we have the strength to follow my teacher's advice, put on our shoes, and get to work. May today bring enlightenment. May tomorrow bring action. Kenya Hiratzon, may it be God's will.